Jerry Lembcke is a professor of sociology, a veteran of Vietnam, and the author of The Spitting Image, which asks the question, were veterans really spat on when they came home from the war in Vietnam? This is Jerry Lembcke. I'm Duncan Gammy. You're listening to Dunk Tank. All right, I'm here with Jerry Lembcke. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
So the way that I had heard about you is through your book, The Spitting Image. Could you, just so we have something to start off with here, could you give us a brief synopsis of what that book is supposed to be about?
Sure. I got interested in the issue during the run up to the Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War in 1991, when there were claims that Vietnam veterans had been spat on, and we, the American people, should not do that again. As our soldiers go off to the Persian Gulf, they need to know that they will be received positively when they come home and not be spat on like Vietnam vets were. I thought that sounded wrong. I'm a veteran of Vietnam. Not only had never seen or experienced any of these spitting stories, but I had never heard of them at the time in the fall of 1990. So I began to look into where and when they first began to be told. I found actually no evidence that such things had ever happened, and actually found no claims from back in the day, that is the late 60s, early 70s, that these things were happening. And so that sort of then piqued my interest. Okay, so where do stories like this come from? And to cut to the chase on that, and I'm sure you and I will go back over a lot of this, then I found that basically these stories they have a mythical element to them. There are things that even if nobody makes such a claim, somebody is going to imagine that this or something like this had actually happened. So there's some people who deal in these kinds of studies would recognize an element of urban legend in that for reasons we don't fully understand, at a certain point in time, certain kinds of stories just seem to spring up like mushrooms in no particular place and under no particular kinds of conditions. But all of a sudden, these stories just kind of begin to circulate. And in a sense, that's where my book goes. I felt that they fit into the mythology that we had lost the war in Vietnam because of betrayal at home. That is, radicals in the streets, liberals in Congress, had tied one hand behind our backs, and so we lost the war mostly because of what happened on the home front. And these spitting stories fit into that. They're a story about how people at home did not support the war, did not support the veterans when they came home, and that kind of became the dominating narrative, and still is the dominating narrative, I think, of the war and why we lost the war. And that narrative has great consequences then, I think, going forward right up to today and right into, say, the Trump movement that wants to make America great again, which takes us back to the 1950s, when some Americans believe America was great, and we lost that greatness in the 1960s, and particularly with the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's so incredible because this myth is buried very deep in our consciousness, and I guess we should be clear that it you know I suppose it's hard to prove a negative. So in your book, you don't necessarily say that it's impossible that this ever happened, that veterans were spat on, but just that every instance of someone claiming that it did happen turned out not to have any evidence, right?
That's you very well put. It's the lack of evidence that it ever did happen. That's right.
And what compelled you to write this book? Was it at all personal? Because I know
No,
we no? Okay.
No, not personal. I think at the beginning I saw it as a defamation of the anti-war movement. It made anti-war activists look pretty darn bad. That is, anti-war activists of the Vietnam era. And then because of that, it discouraged a new generation of activists in 1990 and 1991 from opposing the looming war in the Persian Gulf, because young people, students of mine at the College of Holy Cross, were saying, gosh, if we oppose the war, does that mean we will be looked at as those radicals in the 1960s who spat on Vietnam veterans when they came home? This is not just a hypothetical. Students of mine raised questions like that with me in 1990, 1991, and indeed some faculty members at the time argued with me and said that my take on it was wrong. They were around at that time, and so they're certain that these things happened. So that's what kind of started my engine. That's what got me going on this.
It's really funny the way that memory works that way, because one of the things that I believe you talk about in your book is, if you just look at this from a common sense perspective, can you possibly imagine that some guy returning from Vietnam, a very hard, tough place, sees some skinny hippie spitting on him and then just walks away? He doesn't fight the guy, he doesn't do anything. Like, it just seems implausible on its face. You talked about the fact that there were an urban legend aspect that these stories started to take on. Could you talk about that element a little bit? In what ways was that evident?
Well, it's actually where I come down on that is that these stories are more mythical in terms of their content than urban legend, because and I don't mean to slide off your question, but
No, sure.
They do go back to as far back as the Odyssey. Odysseus comes home and finds Penelope living with a group of suitors. I think is how it's the word that's used. A group of other young men, and so he feels betrayed by the woman at home. Now, if we run the clock way forward, then in the wake of World War I, Germany is defeated, soldiers come home, and the stories there do involve spit. They're spat on, they have their insignia ripped off their uniforms, and the perpetrators are very often women and young girls. So there is this, and now we come up to the post-Vietnam years in the United States. It is once again women and young girls who are alleged as often as men to be the spitters. So there is this element of them that certainly with the stories of Odysseus predate the transition from pre-modern to modern in the stories. So I think I would just leave your question at that.
Okay. Yeah, the fact that much of the time it was young girls spitting on the veterans. Why did you think that detail was significant?
Because the loss of the war in Vietnam represented to the American culture a loss of manhood, or the absence of sufficient manhood to have won the war. The men who had been sent to fight the war, were not up to our calling. American masculinity, particularly in the 1950s, although interesting here again. Now your question of urban legend comes back into play, because by some studies, by some cultural studies, the 1950s had an effeminizing effect on American men, and that involved the urbanization of the country. We had raised a generation of soft men who were not up to what it would take to win a war. We were not the men that our fathers were of the World War II generation. And why do we think that? Or why do some Americans think that? Well, when we came home from Vietnam, me included, I grew my hair as long as I possibly could when I got home. Even while I was still in Vietnam, I was wearing a necklace with a peace symbol on it. Not long after I got home, I had the uniform I came home with, my girlfriend embroidered it. So all of these sort of feminizing signia of men, even men like me who went to Vietnam, suggest that a rising femininity in the culture was the betraying element. To go back to what I said earlier, we lost the war according to the narrative because the war was lost on the home front. And what that meant was that this softness in American culture had bubbled to the top, and it had sapped our young men of the will to war. It had sapped the nation of its will to support the war. And so the betraying cultural element in that was femininity. And if we lost the war, if we, the men, lost the war, or if you men lost the war, then who was the war really lost to? It was lost to women, you see. And so the imaginations go. I mean, even if then you only hear that soldiers were spat on, and if you believe that, but you are left then to imagine, so who would the spitters have been? You put two and two together, all right? It was women, and indeed, here's a fact, right, that women were very prominent in the anti-war movement, you see. That's a fact. You put that together with, well, then somebody who didn't like our soldiers when they came home spat on them. Who likely were the spitters? It's women, you see. You see how it all, it's, my book is really, in some sense, less about the empirical question, was anybody spat on or not, right, than it is about the study of why some people believe that veterans were spat on. So it becomes a study really of, I don't know, the mind, the culture, the imagination, you see?
Yeah,
that's really what the book is about.
It definitely is. And you go into the extensive efforts by the Nixon administration to sort of drive a wedge between veterans and the anti-war movement. Is that some of where this story comes from, or did that just develop organically?
Well, that is... what are my choices there?
Sorry. In other words, was this story something that was put out? Was the spitting myth something that was put out by the Nixon administration, or were their efforts separate and apart from that?
I thought when I began to look at this that I would find the smoking gun in a speech that Nixon or Vice President Spiro Agnew made, in which they said Vietnam veterans are being spat on. Never found it. Never have found it. And I thought that I would find a newspaper, a cartoonist, someplace who drew an image of a Vietnam vet being spat on. Never found it. Nor has anybody ever presented it to me. And so, as years have gone on, I become more and more certain that it's not out there. Although, again, to go back to your original words, can't prove that it's not there. But what they did say, Nixon and Agnew, was that there was hostility from the anti-war movement. That they did allege. They did allege that soldiers were not being welcomed home the way soldiers from other wars had been. Agnew made some homophobic statements about anti-war veterans who had joined the anti-war movement. The implication there being they're veterans, but they're not real men. So you see, again, that's a denigration of the manhood that was sent off to fight this war. We were not up to the task of that. So now, to go back to the second part of your question, was there something more organic? And I think, yeah, that is. I think that the Nixon-Agnew people and their minions, their people around them, were hip enough to know that these stories of hostility to war veterans are very potent. And if you just kind of dangle the bait in front of people, they will take it. So they could have been these people who knew this. Maybe historians, historians friendly to the Nixon-Agnew camp, who knew the World War I story, right? Or maybe some classicist who knew the Odysseus story. There are people who study these things, right? And all they have to do is drop a dime, and a Nixon or an Agnew picks up on that.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. Again, the World War One sort of stab in the back narrative that Germans invented. That the only reason we lost was because we got stabbed in the back. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about the parallels there between the German narrative and the American one?
Well, the German narrative, there's a number of components to that. One is that toward the end of the war, there was a rebellion within the ranks of the German military that I suppose in some sense brought the war to an end, or would have brought the war to an end. That's one thing. And we see that also then in the American case. The rebellion in Vietnam grew to that point also by the end of the war. A second thing, which I've already, I think, probably spoken to enough, is the gendered nature of the stories, both in Germany and in the World War, in the U.S. Vietnam War case. Then there's also the race, ethnic, Semitic component to it. We know in Germany that the scapegoating of Jews, or put it this way, we know about the scapegoating of Jews leading up to the Holocaust, but not all Americans know that scapegoating was rooted in the loss of the war of World War I. Jews were really targeted as having been opposed to the war and blamed then for the loss of the war. And the tie-in there, to some extent, then is also with the political element of this, that it was communist, that it was the communist left that opposed the war in Germany, and then communists were also then scapegoated after the war, and the ramp up to World War II and the Holocaust, and some very prominent communists in Germany were Jews, and to sort of tie the package together, then they were also very central to the class movement in Germany, the rise of the German working class, and the trade unions in Germany at the time. So that really was, as I say, the package then in Germany. Now, if you disaggregate all of that and run the whole thing forward up to the post-Vietnam War years, you see most of that, again, the gender stuff, as I've already said, the political element. The anti-war activists were regularly accused of being communist or being dupes of the communists, having been swayed into pro-communist positions, and by the end of the war, important U.S. labor organizations like the UAW had come out against the war also. So you've got most of that post-World War I package on replay in the wake of Vietnam and in the wake of the Lost War in Vietnam, the scapegoating that goes on in particular. One of the things I use in speeches that I give, one of the images is from a G.I. Joe 1986 comic in which one of the panels shows a Vietnam veteran being spat on, and he is posed as a very arrogant figure. Looks nothing like anybody coming home from Vietnam. Looks all the world like somebody coming home from World War II. Very Aryan, stereotypically Aryan. And the spitter is a young woman, curly black hair, who one of my students said immediately was, she looks Jewish.
Oh, wow.
And there's a big wad of spit coming from her mouth onto the veteran, and his speech bubble says, the first thing that happened when I got off the plane at the San Francisco airport was being spat on, I think he says by a hippie, and called a baby killer. So there you have the whole thing. Now, important for me to add here, and to go back to something previously, as I said, no claims in newspapers, no editorial cartoon portraying this, no images whatsoever until 1986, a G.I. Joe comic book panel. This is the very first imaging of this that I have found, and I've said this many times in writing and on air. And I'll say it again. If anybody has anything earlier than I would love to have it. But this is 1986, Duncan. You see,
yeah.
This is long after the war, and there it is. And this is prior to the 1990-1991 run up to the first Persian Gulf War. So I use this when I give talks. I have it on a PowerPoint panel, and I can spend a half hour, 40 minutes just talking my way through this cartoon panel, because it just has everything. Including an airport background that does not look like San Francisco Airport in 1970. It looks like Casablanca in 1942. You see the whole thing. It's all you get the point there that not only is this a veteran being spat on, but it's a phase of American history, a historic period of America that we're all proud of, right? That we all know that this was the high point of American culture, World War II, and that's what's being spat on. You see, it's not just the veteran, but it's that America that is being spat on, and that's the America that Trump wants to make great again. It's that revanchist sentiment you see in his political shtick that ties back historically to those post World War II years, the good years.
No, it definitely is, and it's interesting that comic strip because it does, as you said, include so many of the elements. I mean, the idea of people waiting at the airport with, they got their loogies ready. Um, it is literally, in this sense, comical. Um, what you mentioned the
Fanciful. You see,
yes.
fanciful. It's an invention of a cartoonist.
You mentioned though the baby killer slur or name calling. Was that something that went on, or was that also a myth?
It's a myth, um, I'll issue the call here. This is a book that needs to be written. There needs to be a book written about the mythology of the baby killer imagery. This is what I have done, listeners, using LexisNexis and the New York Times archive. I've gone back to the Vietnam War years and looked for the phrase baby killer used in the context of the war or the anti-war movement, and I think I found zero. The phrase baby killer is there, but it's almost always associated with abortion and the abortion rights movement and the opposition to that. That's the context. Until you get into the post-World War, into the post-Vietnam War years, and I don't have that data in front of me. I don't know. Maybe sometime around 19. Oh, I think maybe. Does Rambo in the first Yes, in the first Rambo movie, he says, as he's being talked down from his rampage by Colonel Troutman, he says, "And those maggots at the airport spitting, call me baby killer and all kinds of vile crap. Who are they?" That's Rambo.
Right. Yeah, he does.
Baby killer. That's one of the. I don't know if in anything I've written, if I have claimed that that's the first in which I'm aware of baby killer. I'm not sure. But that would, you see, that would be early 80s, and that would have certainly been one of the first, and probably the most prominent invocation of that. So like the spitting stories, there's no evidence of anybody. Now, and you see, this is interesting. Some people say to me, "Well, how could there be a photograph of spitting?" Of course, there couldn't be a photograph of that. And I have to nod and say, "Yeah, that would be kind of tough." But there are claims made by Vietnam vets, claiming to be Vietnam vets, or other people who say that protesters at the airports met veterans with placards, right, signs reading "baby killer." Oh, where there would have to be photographs of that. I've never seen them. I've looked at scores of panoramic photographs of rallies, anti-war rallies, and gatherings of anti-war activists. I have never seen a sign with anything like that. Again, it might be there. I'd love to see it, but I've never seen it.
Yeah. That's you when you talk about Rambo, it's something that it's an interesting topic to bring up because that is a very I mean, probably even more than the GI Joe. I think that is where that myth got cemented in our popular culture.
Yeah.
Um, as a veteran of Vietnam and as a scholar, I mean, did you have any particular reaction to that movie?
Oh, um, I just chuckled,
Because
didn't I?
because the idea is that we're sticking up for the veterans.
Yeah. Well, by the time that film came out, I had seen other Hollywood films. I don't know that Rambo had any particular effect on me.
Okay. Were there any of those prominent movies about Vietnam that you thought accurately or close to accurately depicted that experience, or no?
Well, first of all, almost all of the so-called Vietnam War films are coming home films. For the film chapter in The Spitting Image, I looked at about 100 films, which, by the way, that was before there was Netflix and anything else. One of my great experiences was going to the Library of Congress, which everybody knows houses every published book, but few people know that it houses almost all films made in the United States. So that was just a wonderful experience for me. And then also, I went to Los Angeles to do archival research on the 1978 film Coming Home. Just another terrific experience. So I looked at all of these films. Almost all of the films are coming home films. They're post-war films. They're not about the war in Vietnam at all, which is important because then what most Americans see on film, and you mentioned a minute ago about the creation of memory and memory. So the memory that many Americans have of the war is, of course, something they get from film, and what they get from film is the coming home story. They don't get much about the war in Vietnam. You and I, if we wanted to take the time, we could probably name a half dozen films, like Platoon is one that is set in Vietnam. Full Metal Jacket is mostly, I guess we would say, set in Vietnam. Apocalypse Now is set in Vietnam. There's not too many beyond that most Americans have seen. One of the best is one called Go Tell the Spartans, that very few people have seen. It came out in the early mid 70s. Very few people have seen it, but it's a great film. Not only do the Americans lose the big battle in that film, but Go Tell the Spartans, the title of the film, is intended to say, go tell your fellow Americans what happened here, right? This is what's going to happen if you stay here and fight this war. But I'm rambling a bit there.
No, you're good. You're good.
But it's so what goes down in American memory as gained from Hollywood film is the coming home story, and almost all of that helps construct the betrayal narrative, and very importantly, to construct the victim veteran imagery. Nary a veteran in these films is portrayed as healthy, physically or mentally healthy. And you see how easily that fits into the betrayal narrative. Many lines are spoken in these films of the type, the hard part was coming home. The worst part was coming home. In one of the films, the guy says, the guys who got it lucky are the ones who never came home. Can you imagine? That sort of mindset that made these films, for one thing, and then what that does to American memory, you see, of the war. These guys portrayed in these films are, they're pathological killers. They're basket case trauma cases. Really a lot of very screwed up men, apparently, as seen by Hollywood. Came home from. Then there are no anti-war, very few anti-war veterans in these films, almost none. You see.
But there were in reality.
Oh my, yes, sure. Yeah. I mean, most guys came home from the war, went quietly back home to work, back to school, right, back to their normal lives. The main publicly visible Vietnam vets were those who were opposed to the war, who got active in an organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, who became very active in the anti-war movement. John Kerry would be, a prominent example of that. Really jump-started his political career as being an anti-war veteran. But that's pretty much all that's gone from American memory now.
Right. That and so much of this, when we talk about memory, it's really shocking. I guess it shouldn't be that there are people who swear that this happened to them or that they saw this, and yet a lot of this is just stuff that happened decades ago, and they're sort of piecing together the memories from movies and what other people are saying. That image of the broken veteran who's just shell shocked, drug addicted. How did that sort of play into this larger myth? And I mean, did the idea that veterans were broken and had PTSD just out of their minds, basically, did that make it easier to sort of marginalize their stories or damage their credibility?
Oh, sure. The origin of PTSD as a diagnostic category lies in, I want to take those words back. Not necessarily the origin of it. Here's what I want to say. It was the anti-war veterans that were a problematic image for Americans and for American news reporters, and I think for Hollywood. The war was lost. The veterans who had fought the war and lost the war are now opposed to the war. In fact, even before the war was over, guys were coming home opposed to the war. This was a storyline that America had never had to deal with. First of all, the Lost War. Hollywood never had to deal with a lost American war. American news reporters never had to deal with this. Soldiers coming home opposed to the very war that they had fought. Hollywood never had to deal with this. The American people never had to deal with this. News reporters did not deal with this. So as early as the early 70s, as early as the 1972 presidential campaign when Vietnam vets turned out in large numbers from across the country to protest the renomination of Richard Nixon for the Republican Party nomination at Miami Beach. The press did not know how to cover this, and so it covered it as troubled men who had come home with difficulty dealing with a war which at that point was not over yet, but nearly over and going down as a lost war. So the press covered these veterans as guys who are having trouble dealing with a war that they had lost, you see. And if we just stop and think, well, that would seem kind of reasonable. Yeah, okay. it would. But then that pursuit got turned into an opportunity by mental health professionals. Psychiatrists in particular were very quick to not just problematize Vietnam vet behavior, but to pathologize it, right? To turn it into something that needs to be treated, that can be treated and needs to be treated. So there's a very famous New York Times story, which I quote and I cite in the book. I should have the book open right now so I could give you the details. But it was right about opening day of the night of the Republican Party convention, in which the New York Times wrote about these vets being there to protest Richard Nixon. And this story, Duncan, is just loaded with psychiatric terminology. Broken men, dangerous behavior, on and on. Probably 6 or 8 phrases that I compiled out of the story that would make it sound as if these guys who are in the streets ought to be in a mental health facility. So in some sense, there's a real contradiction there. I mean, these men are obviously dedicated. They're very strong. They're very courageous. At least that's the way I would see it. But here, the news story is totally reinterpreting this, recasting their appearance and their behavior. And I use the word displacement. What this does is it displaces one set of imagery, that is the activist Vietnam vets who are in the streets, with another set of imagery, right, that has the same vets, in some sense the same behavior being portrayed, but a different mode of discourse, you see, a different set of terminology to describe and to record what is actually going on. So you see, there's a lot of softness there in the boundaries, but it has the effect of kind of pushing off screen one set of imagery from memory and pulling on to the screen another set of imagery. And it's that second set that then sticks in the public mind because it helps the public make sense, you see, of what's going on. Veterans in the streets protesting their own war doesn't make sense. Veterans in the streets expressing their frustration, expressing their anger about the war, expressing their hostility to Richard Nixon. All of that is rational You see, all of that is a way of the American people understanding, reshaping what is actually there into something that they can deal with.
Right. And yeah, the idea that why would these people come home and protest the war that they were supposed to be fighting and winning? It must be crazy.
They must be really hurt.
Right. So I don't want to take up too much of your time here. So my last question has to deal with this concept you introduced of the reticent veteran, of the veteran who doesn't really want to talk about it in terms of war experience. So much of what we've talked about today is based on sort of a failure of communication, perhaps, of not really probing deeply or questioning. For people who have people who are non-veterans, let's say, and who have loved ones who served and who don't want to talk about it, how would you approach this phenomenon?
You mean if I was faced with a person who says her grandfather doesn't talk about it, or is that your question?
Yes.
I've been in the situation. The very first thing I ask is, have you ever asked him about it? And I don't think I've ever gotten yes for an answer. I have gotten no for an answer, or I get answers that kind of slide off the question. But I've had this experience a couple of times in public when I've been the guest speaker or something, and somebody in the audience raises their hand, and I'll say, well, did you ever ask? And the answer is almost always no, or well, no, or sometimes I'll say, I don't know what to ask. And if it goes to that, then I will say, well, maybe you should, try to find out as much as you can, maybe from relatives, find out, was he in the Army? Or I said, just ask, Granddad, you were in Vietnam War, excuse me. You were in Vietnam. Were you in the Army or in the Marines? Or what? Just ask basic questions like that, and then ask, what did you do? Although the what did you do question then is usually the one that supposedly, they clam up on or they don't talk about. But I'm not totally sure that I'm not totally convinced that the veteran who doesn't want to talk about it actually exists.
Really?
It's been said many times about Vietnam veterans. Oh, my dad never wanted to talk about it. My uncle never wanted to talk about it. Going back to the early 70s, most Vietnam vets, you couldn't shut them up, or I should say us. You couldn't shut us up. I mean, we welcomed the chance to talk about it. I visited more high school classes than I can count, more radio interviews than I can count, and I'm sure lots of other guys would say the same thing. So at least for Vietnam veterans, in general, it's just not true. Now, what I think, and here I'm being sociologist or anthropologist, I'm saying that when the person says my uncle never wanted to talk about it, my hunch is that the niece or the nephew saying that does not really want to know about it, does not really want to know what the uncle has to say about it. And that might be because the family lore about the uncle might be an invention, a very flattering invention that the niece or the nephew does not want to have challenged, does not want to know what the uncle really thinks about this. And so there might be a symbiotic thing going on there too. The uncle doesn't want to say, because then the family imagination that he did something heroic might have to be challenged. I think that when veterans don't want to say anything, if that's the case, it might be because they have nothing to say, that they didn't do anything in Vietnam that is anything anybody would want to talk about or hear about. And so by saying nothing, it lets the listener's imagination run wild. Uncle John must have seen some really heavy shit in Vietnam. And now he's afraid of wanting to revisit that. All right, I'm not going to ask anything more. And so the niece or the nephew walks away thinking Uncle John must have been in some really deep stuff in Vietnam. So there is a...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's... As I say, of course, I'm being sociologist there, I'm being anthropologist there. I have written an article. It's in a journal called Peace and Change, the Journal of the American Peace History Society. And I have written there about the reticent veteran, or the legend of the reticent veteran, that you might be referring to that. You might have seen that. And so I write about it there, so listeners can look at that and see what more I have to say.
Definitely, that's almost sounds like a comedy bit. What you just mentioned, the idea of this guy who went to Vietnam and maybe was a graphic designer or something like that, or sitting in an office somewhere and.
A chaplain's assistant, like I was.
Yeah, a chaplain's assistant, exactly. And their kids like, oh man, don't want to bring it up with Dad. Must have seen some crazy shit. Like,
right?
No. Well, on that note, this was. I hope this was as enjoyable for you as it was for me. Jerry, thank you very much.
You're good. You ask good questions.
I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for the call.
Thank you to Jerry Lembcke, and thanks for listening to Dunk Tank. See you next time.